Welcome to our Early American History video part 1. We will have a combination of voice and then external videos to watch while you learn about the Articles of Confederation and early American history. The first form of government that the United States used was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were a weak union which gave states most of the power. As you can see, every state had one vote. 9 of the 13 states were required to make a law, and 13 of the 13 states were required to change the Articles of Confederation. Responsibility and power rested mainly with the states. This was nice for some things, but it led to some serious weaknesses, as we'll see down the road. One of the things that the Articles of Confederation did was make the new lands acquired in the West part of the United States, and they did a good job for it. They divided the land into territories. You might have watched an old Western where they talked about the Oklahoma Territory. And these territories could become states with full and equal standing, just like the original 13 colonies. Congress would appoint a governor for the territory, and when 5,000 people were in the territory, they'd get a temporary constitution. 60,000 people, and there'd be a state constitution approved by Congress, and they could apply for admission as statehood. The Land Ordinance of 1785 worked on surveying the land. Basically, townships were established by 6 miles and 6 miles square, 6 by 6. The 16 square was reserved for schools, and the township land was sold to raise money. You might live in the township of Day or Rock or McMillan. That's from the old township from the Northwest Ordinance. Out west, the land isn't necessarily divided like this. This was the surveying system from the old Northwest Ordinance. So why did the Articles of Confederation not work? Well, the Articles could not tax. They could not raise a military. States could ignore the laws and treaties, and states taxed each other and put tariffs on each other. States had their own money. It was really chaotic. There was no executive branch to enforce the laws, no national court system, no Supreme Court, and any change to the Articles of Confederation required all 13 states to approve it. In the reading pack I gave you, there are several specific examples of why the Articles of Confederation failed. Stop the video at this point and look in those packets for things regarding debt, tariffs, money, military, etc. One of the big failures of the Articles of Confederation was Shays' Rebellion. Shay was a former colonial soldier in Massachusetts, and he led an armed rebellion for money and to get paid back dues from the war and in opposition to the current government. And the problem was there was no military to put it down. To put down a military, states had to agree to send their militias. There was no organized army. It was sort of like you asked the states and the states would send people if there was a problem. There was no commander-in-chief. There was no central authority to tax to raise an army. This really highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation with Shays' Rebellion. At this point, stop the video and stop my video and watch the Articles of Confederation video, which is video 1 external on the web page. Well, most people decided that the Articles of Confederation were not enough, and it was time to make something new. The Constitution that we studied in first semester. The new Constitution, as you know, has 3 branches of government: the executive, judicial, and legislative. There was a convention, and it was meant to revise the Articles of Confederation, but actually what happened is it completely abolished them. It changed them. It came up with something new, the Constitution. More central power. Power with the executive branch to enforce the law, Congress to tax and raise a military, and a Supreme Court eventually to deal with disputes between states. And remember the delegated and enumerated powers and reserved powers. Some things were left for the states, but common sense things like making one money and dealing with immigration were left for the federal government. There were some important compromises, though. Not everybody agreed exactly how this should be set up. There was the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise will be in the next slide. Stop now and watch the video on political compromises. And understand that the Great Compromise was about the Virginia and New Jersey plans, and the Three-Fifths Compromise was about slavery. Not everyone was happy with the new Constitution. Those that wanted the Constitution passed were called Federalists. Those that didn't were called Anti-Federalists and thought it gave too much power to the central government. One way the Constitution did get passed was the Federalist Papers. Men like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote really persuasive, powerful essays in support of the new Constitution. These were published in newspapers and throughout the colonies, and it helped turn the tide to get people to vote for the Constitution. Washington was, of course, our first president, and one of the things he did was establish a cabinet and pick his helpers. Of course, Adams was vice president, and Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson was a well-respected man. He was a diplomat, and he was the Secretary of State. Early in Washington's presidency, there was another rebellion called the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton wanted to put a tax, an excise tax, a tax on a particular product like we have on gasoline on whiskey. Farmers in Pennsylvania had been making whiskey for years, and they used it not only, of course, as something to consume, but as a way to take wealth in corn and condense it down to something more transportable in barrels. And they used it to barter. It was almost like a currency in rural Pennsylvania. And farmers were not too happy about paying this tax on whiskey, so they actually took up arms. Now we have a different story. Instead of the chaos that Shays' Rebellion had, when states wouldn't send troops and there was no organized army to put it down, there was now a federal army that was paid for by Congress. In fact, it had a commander-in-chief, George Washington. And the boys in Pennsylvania pretty quickly backed down when they saw that Washington supported this new government and there was a federal army that would not tolerate this kind of rebellion against authority. Remember, this power to tax was representative power. They had representation in Washington. Alexander Hamilton, very interesting man. Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. The Treasury is responsible for money and debt, issuing things like savings bonds that you guys might have. So what did Hamilton do? Hamilton decided that the U.S. economy needed to be on a sound footing. Hey, that sounds like a pretty nice thing to do right now. So the states were arguing what to do with the debt. The South didn't have as much debt as the northern states, and Hamilton said, let's take all the debt together and pay it off nationally. We'll make all the individual colony debt national debt. We'll pay it off, we'll pay off the war bonds, and we'll have good credit. And they want to take him off the $10 bill. What? Then Hamilton went a little further. Hamilton was, at heart, someone who liked the northern manufacturers, business, and industry. So he came up with a few plans. One was to put tariffs on imports. A tariff is a tax, and it raises the price of imported goods. This helps domestic manufacturers or companies inside the United States because they have less competition. He also wanted to create a national bank, the BUS, the Bank of the United States. The bank would issue money, but it would also make loans to businesses. The South didn't like this. They didn't want the business loans. They were plantation farmers. They didn't need that. And the South didn't have as much debt, so they weren't sure why they were paying everything off for the northern states. A compromise was reached. Hamilton got his Bank of the United States, and he got the debt deal, and the Southerners got the capital city, the new city named after George Washington, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, between Maryland and Virginia in its own little area. Again, the South didn't like Hamilton's plan. Debts had already been paid by the South. There was another thing, though. Some people thought Hamilton's plan was unconstitutional. There was a question, especially by Jefferson, on what the states could do or what the federal government could do relative to the states. Take a look at the next slide. Jefferson says the end of democracy and the defeat of the American Revolution will occur when the government falls into the hands of moneyed corporation. Stop here for a minute and think about this. What would Jefferson think of our government today? Washington says goodbye, and he gives some warnings. He warns against political parties. He says the United States should remain neutral when it comes to wars and foreign affairs. And he warned against having a powerful standing military. He also wanted unity. He saw on the horizon some conflict between North and South, between different political factions, especially Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams. And he was concerned. He was concerned that individual political factions would rip apart the United States. And he had good reason to be concerned. Very soon after Washington leaves, two political parties form: the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. The old Federalists and Anti-Federalists kind of split off here, and we have two different ideas of what this new nation should look like and how it should be set up. Stop the video for a second and go to this overview of the political parties on the Gilder-Lehrman website. Take a look at what the Federalists felt and what the Anti-Federalists felt. And this is one of the discussions we're going to have next week. Where do you think the Republicans today fit in, and where do you think the Democrats fit in? It's not perfect, and there's not the social issues of abortion and things like that. It's really on the size of the government and the scope of the government. Check out this crash course video too. This will be number 3 on the external video website. It's pretty interesting on what these two parties believed and how they felt things should be set up. Basically, we have two different philosophies: strict construction and loose construction. Jefferson believed in strict construction. The federal government could only do the things the Constitution said it could do. He wanted a very limited interpretation. And he wanted to give most of the power to states outside of the basic national things that national government should do. And he wanted a sort of a nation of small farmers and small merchants. Hamilton, on the other hand, wanted a nation of business, of commerce, of manufacturing, of large merchants, of large industry. And therefore, he was a loose constructionist. If the Constitution didn't say you couldn't do it, and it kind of seemed like it was something that was supportive of the enumerated powers, for example, the power to tax, the power to regulate trade. Okay, we need a national bank. Then it's okay. Who believes in strict and loose construction today? Which party, the Democrat or Republican, would be a strict constructionist or a loose constructionist for the Constitution? Well, as you can see, early on in our history, we start to get the political parties. Here is the first vote, very close. Federalist Adams versus Democratic Republican Jefferson. Adams wins, but by a narrow margin. And look where his support is. Does this make sense that he supports manufacturing? Now here's the election of 1800. In this one, Democratic Republican Jefferson wins. Look at where his support comes from, okay? And you could see how the country split up based on political lines. This ends part 1 of our video. Go to video part 2, and we'll pick up with the War of 1812.